I'm going to move on now to introduce Dr. Claire Craig, CB. Claire is the Director of Science Policy at the Royal Society, the Independent Scientific Academy of the UK and the Commonwealth, and she's also at the Science Policy Centre, and their work covers policy for science, science policy and education policy. Previously, Claire led the Government's Office for Science, which supports the Chief Scientific Advisor. She originally joined the civil service to run a foresight programme of science-based strategic futures covering topics from flood risk to cognitive enhancement. Whilst at Foresight, she was awarded a CBE for her work, and she became a faculty member of the World Economic Forum at Davos. Claire's also worked on strategy and science in decision-making in public, private and not-for-profit sectors, and her career includes periods at McKinsey & Co. and the CBI. So a huge wealth of experience that Claire has there, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So Claire, can I welcome you?
Thank you very much. So I'm using the roving mic. Is that working? Excellent. What I wanted to start with is to say that to do futures, you have to be a little bit bold and extremely humble. So the point is that in much of the time, as Sophie said right at the start, individually and collectively, we're making assumptions about the future. We're making decisions that will affect it, where to build a house or a road, or whether a wind farm or an oil well, whether to pay for a pension, whether to have children. And the question is how far we examine the assumptions that are behind those decisions, and how making those decisions can be better if we do that examination. And in fact, whatever we think about the future, however clever we think we are, in most of the time, privately and publicly, what we're doing is the evolutionary default, which is to think that the near future, at the least, is going to be very much like the present, which really means the near past. And that's a very evolutionarily helpful default setting, and it's the most useful. If you have to make one assumption, it's actually the most useful. But it leads to very strange things. So, for example, there is a lovely linear correlation. If you ask people when they think they are next going to experience a storm, between the length of time they think they're going to when they next think they're going to experience a storm and when they last experienced one. What that means in practice is that even if a scientist tells them that what they saw last year was a 1 in 100-year event, they're more likely to think that that will happen next than a 1 in a 10-year event, which they haven't experienced for 5 years. Now, you can do better, once you've recognised that. You can do better, however, and this is the bold bit, than then throwing up your hands and saying, well, it's all so uncertain, it's all so complex, that really there's no point in thinking about it in a kind of explicit and cognitive fashion at all. So the bold part is to step into the uncertainty that the previous speaker was describing and to actually try and make some sense of it. The humble part, and the reason why people don't do futures more often, is that the one thing you can be absolutely sure about is that you'll be wrong. You may be quite significantly wrong, as in not by and large anticipating the fall of the Berlin Wall or the timing of the economic crash or all of the political ramifications of Brexit. You may be slightly wrong in timing or in style, like the Garden City and the TV wristwatch that I'm going to show you later on. But wrong you will be. The prize is that by having thought about the future at all, even though you don't get it right, you expose your unexamined assumptions, and you're more likely to know what you really want to achieve, and you're more likely to have robust ways of doing that. You're also, and I'm not going to talk so much about this, but it is another important strand, you're also, if you look at the very improbable but high-impact futures, you're likely to be more resilient to whatever the economy, technology, fate, the planet, the galaxy throws at you. So, sticking with the being humble for a moment. Adair Turner led the review that led to the policy that increased the state pensions age, and he was also the chair of the Climate Change Committee, amongst other things. And he said this, and the point here is that any statement which is perfectly true is so bounded, it's so qualified, it's so accurately expressed that it really only makes sense to others in that particular domain of expertise or discipline. And it certainly can't really be applied to any messy, forward-looking situation. He was actually talking about the use of scientific evidence in government, but it's a helpful reminder for futures work too. And the point is, however, that despite not being true, well done futures is extremely useful. Now, I'm going to talk briefly further about futures work in government, and as Sophie said, this largely draws on time with the Foresight programme, working for various government chief scientific advisors. What that also does, though, is connect into knowledge that's developed over the last probably 20 years by practitioners in business, such as the famous work of Shell, which is going back some now, more than 20 years. Individuals, some of whom in this room, like Bill and Kat, who've contributed to that sort of work, and nation states. Singapore is the kind of prime example of a nation state that has a long history of futures work, largely because it has a very strong national strategic function. And also more recent experience with the US, their Congressional Government Accountability Office, for example, and the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. There is lots of immensely exciting, aspirational, inspirational futures work around. There's also a lot of fiction and non-fiction about utopias and dystopias. And there's even work on why humans are so interested in utopias and dystopias. We find them fascinating. That sort of inspirational futures work can be great fun, and it can be terrifying, actually, and it's essential in its place. But what I'm talking about here is a rather more sober task, primarily about trying to get well-founded, robust evidence into the democratic decision-making when you're faced with this problem. This one. So, what are the prizes for doing futures in government? Well, there are lots, but the first is a better solution to this, better links between historic evidence, because most people, when you really get down to it, when they're talking about evidence, what they mean is observational evidence, and therefore, by definition, it's historic. Humans are always using their experience to anticipate and to think about the future. They may be using mental models or computational models. They might be using intuition or narrative or values, ideologies, but a lot of the confusion about where we're going and why and how is because of different unexamined ways of thinking about what we know, typically backward-looking, and what we're trying to do, typically forward-looking. So, one way, and we were hearing about this from the previous speaker as well, one way to use knowledge about the past to inform decisions that will affect decisions today, that will affect the future, is through computational models. This is a classic example, it's also from 2004, but I'll explain why in a minute. So there is historic data for England and Wales of flood damage that goes back many decades. It's collected on a 10-kilometre square grid. You can use this to create a model with the pathways of climate and water and weather and land use that links climate and flood risk and likely future damage. And then with that model, you can begin to test different responses in terms of flood management or housing development or climate mitigation. The Foresight project that did this in 2004 looked at 2080. So what you've got here is just a snapshot of two of the scenarios. There were actually 5 scenarios. 2 of the scenarios, which were called world markets and global responsibility. They're underpinned by heroic assumptions, as you can imagine, to look to 2080. But remember, the question isn't kind of whether to make assumptions, because we're making the assumptions anyhow. The question is are we thinking about what they should be, what those assumptions should be, and are they the best possible? So anyhow, so there were 5 main scenarios for different, and they were run for different combinations of climate and socio-economic growth. And then maps, we created maps of the future risk for both, and not surprisingly, red is where the risk is getting stronger. Overall, in all scenarios, in all plausible scenarios, the level of economic damage overall went up, and there were no plausible mitigation packages that you could run through these models. You can see the right-hand pictures are greener than the left, but still the overall impact, in fact, adding up the red and the green, is significantly negative. The headline figure was that economic damage would go up from 1 billion to 20 billion a year over that period. Now, that was, at its time, that was satisfyingly influential. So the Treasury cited it when they gave DEFRA 300 million more for flood defence, which is always nice. It was actually, I think, much more importantly, part of the discourse at the time that supported the introduction of statutory climate budgets, which was a really leading thing for the UK to do. It was also used in, the modelling was then used in the Shanghai Basin and the US, and I'll come on to the game in a moment. One of the things which I think those of you who are really interested in doing futures will know and will find out is that a lot of the value actually comes from the people who are most closely engaged in it. So it's those who take part. In the case of this project, there were around 200 practitioners and scientists who took part over 2 years with policymakers and regulators. And that process of scoping the questions, of working out what the major uncertainties are, of what levers matter most, that process of itself builds shared knowledge and aspirations and networks and relationships. But if you want to use the project to inform or to stimulate debate with people who haven't been involved with it, then there's nothing like a good number, a good image, a good story, sometimes a good object. And in this case, these maps were actually quite irresistible. So if you show a normal human being one of these, they typically look to see what colour, if they're lucky enough to own a house, what colour square their house is going to be in. The then government chief scientific advisor talks about putting the maps on the cabinet table, at which point every minister kind of reverts to being a constituency MP and looks to see where their constituency is. And it's actually a telling testimony to the power of a good graphic that when the BBC was covering the Somerset Levels flooding more than 10 years later, it was actually showing these maps as the backdrop at one point. They didn't predict what would happen in Somerset Levels in 2014. I have to hasten to add, they're much more global than that. So there we go. Right, now, a second prize for futures work, well done, can be engaging with complexity. And this is from a futures project on the future of obesity, a foresight project. So this is a systems map. This is a systems map. And it's exactly the kind of chart that you don't put in front of a minister or a member of the public, because the only thing it really says is it's incredibly complicated and connected, and they probably knew that already. But the future is a great space to convene conversations that aren't otherwise happening. And in particular, it's a great space to have conversations that are very difficult to have today. So it's often said about science fiction that although it purports to be about the future, it's really always about the present. So, for example, you saw the recent parallelism between the symbols of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale being used by people in the Me Too movement. So, if you're in policy, every area has entrenched interest, entrenched stakeholder groups, typically entrenched departmental interests. So the Foresight project on obesity's principal value was actually in using the complexity and then convening spaces for different departments, particularly, frankly, the kind of debates that go on about, well, it's a health problem, isn't it? No, it isn't a health problem. It would be fine if you would sort out education, leisure, land use, etc., those kind of arguments. So this map helped bring different groups together, but because it purported to be talking about 2050, you can begin to have discussions about, say, budgets, always talking about the long-term future rather than about this year's spending round. You can have those conversations in ways that you can't have so easily when it's actually just about the battles that are happening right now. And the evidence of the modelling from this report was used both by Labour and coalition governments. Some of the policies were significantly different, as you might expect, with different views about the role of the state or the autonomy of the individual. But in both cases, they were founded by the same sets of evidence and the same assumptions. Now, we're talking, in some sense, quite kind of rationally and cognitively, but one of the other prizes from Future's work is it's about emotionally inhabiting the future as well as applying logic to it. On one very rare occasion in the Foresight programme, we actually had a minister who was willing to spend half days working on some scenarios workshops with us. And this requires a bit of mental time travel, okay, so bear with me. It was more than 10 years ago. At that point, we were looking at cybersecurity. It wasn't clear that it was going to be possible for nearly everybody to have their location known. In other words, that it would be socially acceptable for location to be known. And this minister was thinking about the electronic tagging of offenders as a way of keeping them out of prison, but safe. And one of the things that they were concerned about was that that might be deeply socially stigmatizing to have their location known. And it was by taking part in some scenarios that enabled those of us present to inhabit a future that changed their mind about whether that particular concern was one that should stop that policy. So what I'm saying is that feeling what the future might be like is an important part of this. Right, I'm going to need to speed up a little bit. There are many ways of going beyond the kind of more deliberative, evidence-based modelling that we were describing there, but keeping the fundamentals. With the Foresight flooding project, one of the things that we did was introduce a very, very basic simulation software game. But with this one, basically you play it by being in control of a local area, and you make decisions about what to invest in flood defence or in business or in housing. And then the game steps you through a decade of weather and gives you scores depending on what's actually happened and how wet your constituents or your voters are feeling. And the aim is to stay in power for a century. That does quite a lot of things, but one of them is it helps people to get a feel for a highly complex, non-linear system, which is what this is, without actually having to think that what they're doing is dealing with a highly complex, non-linear system. It gives you an intuitive feel for playing a game where, for example, the same strategy, same decisions at one point, the same decisions don't always lead to the same outcome. The final project that I want to talk about was the Foresight project on cities. And this was one where, this is a more recent one, where the main point here is whatever you're doing, there are a lot of different futures techniques and tools that you can use and a lot of different ways of structuring the projects. And I know that many of these are going to be talked about during the course of the day. With the Cities project, there was a national, a national framework which used a number of the methods that you've got here. The one that I haven't talked about yet so much is speculative design, which I'm sure will come up later in the day and is a really, really interesting way of engaging and articulating and beginning to surface views about the future. So a kind of suite of national tools that were available, and the project came to some national conclusions. But what it also did was seed fund some futures work within individual cities who then did quite different things within that framework. So those are some examples, and there's a very good report with a whole suite of tools on the 20 or so projects that were funded, including one in Cardiff. The one I particularly liked here, the Lancaster Youth Chamber, actually the Youth Chamber's view of futures was highly dominated by shopping malls. That seemed to be what the young children were particularly interested in. Anyhow, so in cities, I just wanted to finish by coming back to the kind of boldness and the humility. So one of the papers that was commissioned in the Cities project was a view of the future of cities during the course of the 20th century, so 100 years view of the future. And one of the areas which comes across very strongly, consistently, is garden cities. So garden cities were first formally considered at the very beginning of the 1900s. They have a history throughout the 20th century. And then a couple of years ago, it was really interesting to see a prestigious economic prize was won by an economics firm coming forward with new models for city development on a kind of snowflake pattern that were based on garden city models, but for use in the UK in 2017. So that kind of thinking, that kind of imagining was going on consistently. On the other hand, there are some gorgeous pictures in the report. So there are flying cities and floating cities and cities underground and cities in geodesic domes and so on. And many of those, sadly, haven't yet come to pass. What the report also covers, and this is where I wanted to finish, was it has a picture of this magazine that's on the right here. That's from 1979. And the four little pictures, which are essentially given kind of equal weight, show both the delight and the challenge, the boldness and the humility of futures thinking, because two of them are as far away pretty much as they ever were, colonies in space and zero-gravity sports, Pache Harry Potter. And two of them are pretty much commonplace, solar-heated houses and wristwatch TVs, if you allow for a little bit of license with smartphones. So I wanted to finish with that. Just remember that thinking about the future does sometimes shape the future. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. A number of quotes struck me there, which I'm going to pinch. I particularly like, the only thing you can be certain of is that you'll be wrong, and therefore we do need to be bold. And that sort of reminds me of the fact that I think to make the Future Generations Act a reality, we often talk about being willing to take risks. And I think, we need to take some risks in terms of how we think about the future, even if we get it wrong. Someone said that if we're not failing regularly, or if you're not failing regularly, you're just not trying hard enough. So I think that there's certainly something in that. Claire has got some time for questions. So can you raise your hand if you would like to ask her a question? Malcolm.
Malcolm Moore from Computational Wales. There's been, as you pointed out, quite a number now of futures reports over quite a long period of time. Some of them got more attention than the obesity one, for example, was very high profile for a long time. But what concerns me is that we generate a lot of this, but do we ever evaluate at any stage any of these reports to see how much of what was being suggested in different scenarios, how they're panning out, and what the impact was of these reports on policy making?
Sure. So the formal answer is actually, as far as foresight's concerned, that there were 1 year and then 3 year reviews. So there are actually on the web, certainly for all of the sort of first decade of projects, you can actually go back and look, recommendation by recommendation, what happened. I think in some ways there's a kind of bigger question underlying what you're saying there. So, I think I'll give two answers. I mean, one is clearly kind of the bigger the output, the outcome that you're looking for, and this is like lots of policy work, the bigger the outcome that you are concerned about, the harder it is to show a single cause and effect. So I can say, because Treasury cited it, that the flooding work was well, at least Treasury said that the flooding work caused them to do 300 million. So you could say an outcome of that report was 300 million extra spent on flood management. The big prize was really the carbon statutory budgets and the carbon change, the Climate Change Act. But this would only be one of several inputs to that. So to say that report caused that would be wrong. On the other hand, it could well be that that was part of that kind of climate shift. And I think if you're looking at the big things and we were hearing about before about well-being and mental health and these really big issues, you have to be kind of thoughtful about how you, what you can measure and both do it, because you've got to do it, but also be a bit thoughtful about what kind of impacts you might be having that you can't measure. And just to be really extreme, occasionally on some of the very close to centre of government reports, we've done work where, as it were, the prize has gone to somebody else, or basically, if you want to have influence, and I'm sure those of you in policy know this, sometimes you just give up your idea and it goes to somebody else, and you just do it that for the greater good.
Okay, anyone else?
Julie Atkins, very international. I was interested in your comment about having a future emotionally as well as cognitive. In some of the discussions we've been having, we have stakeholders who look at the future from a very emotional perspective, others who are coming out from a very well-evident scientific basis. Where those two are in conflict, how do you approach the consensus?
By being as explicit as possible about what's going on. So it depends very much on kind of whether you're talking about within one room on one day or at one moment, or whether you're trying to shape wider debates. But in my experience, if you can create an environment where people are able to express the basis of the views that they're holding, and it's a safe enough space that they will allow others to express views held for different reasons, then you can go a long way. It's a real skill to do it, but there are many people who are good at it. I'm thinking, for example, we did some work at the Royal Society recently on AI and the future uses of AI with people of mixed socioeconomic and educational backgrounds and those at the forefront of AI. And because it was very well structured, in this case by Ipsos Mori actually, we got to some really interesting discussions about AI in doctor surgeries or making decisions on finance and so forth that you wouldn't have expected would have been possible given the range of quite strongly held views. So I think it's in the making explicit and it's in creating the space to enable these things to be held together.
Okay, I got this gentleman then, John. Yep, sorry, yeah.
Leadership skills you need to do future work and potentially in the future as well. For me, what you were saying is really just thinking about lots of relational practice, understanding complexity, sense-making, collaboration, dialogue, suspending your own beliefs. But the way we teach and train our public sector leaders is around governance, accountability, traditional structured leadership models. I'm just interested in that tension.
I'm actually struggling to see it as a tension. You're saying that leadership is kind of divorced from analysis or from insight or from.
I think my question stems from listening to work with you on this lot, that we're training people in developing our leaders as people in a way which sort of runs against what we're seeing as the sort of future work, and also the skills needed to do future work.
I think that to do good futures, well, there's probably a difference. To be an actual futures practitioner, and there are several here, that's one thing. To be somebody in a leading position who wants to engage with futures and to use it, then you need to recognise the value both of strong evidence and of plausibility to ground it, and you need to care about the aspirational, normative, emotional side of life. And doing those two things is good leadership. So I think I'm still thinking that good leadership is consistent with using good futures.
I think sometimes the structures don't help. It struck me that your crazy sort of diagram of all the interconnections, I did think initially it was a map of the governance arrangements of Wales. I thought I was sure I could spot an RPB and a PSB and a hairy APB and a God knows what other B on there. So I think, for me, the sort of, with public sector workforce come up in a trained through a silo mentality. We still have a situation where you can spend your entire career in one sector, and the sort of the way in which I suppose you're rewarded is short-term measures, protecting your own budgets and your departments and so on, and that's what we're trying to sort of bust apart and change, and that's what's required for the future, I think. So, John, is there anyone else after John? No. Okay.
John Owen, former civil servant. My observation or
which government department, home domestic department, would you give high scoring for being able to demonstrate futures thinking? And then the continuum from the futures thinking work and options to policy development implementation. Is there one? And then just as an aside, after the financial crash, the Queen went to visit the LSE. And one thing she asked these clever people, including one of my colleagues, did you not see this coming? And that did lead to work being undertaken by government departments. And if I remember rightly, is there something in the sort of civil service handbook which actually says we should actually be doing futures thinking?
So there's quite a lot in that. I'll pick out a few things. One is, and I'm sure the rest of the day will bear this out, there are an awful lot of different ways of doing futures. It's no one thing. So different government departments are doing different sorts of futures in different sorts of ways. And I think that partly reflects the kind of policy issues that they have or that they are party to, since it's usually cross-departmental as well. And it often reflects their levers and their kind of socio-economic and their structural capacity. The one that has the longest history of formal futures work would be the Ministry of Defence. And there you have a very interesting challenge because, of course, in defence, part of the issue is how you measure futures against the counterfactual. So without wanting to get into too kind of airy-fairy about it, part of good futures is often about making things not happen. And how on earth do you ever prove that? So that's one thing. DEFRA has quite a strong tradition, partly because there's a lot of natural sciences involved, and that gives you the kind of basis for quantitative modelling, which is helpful for informing well-founded scenarios. But individual areas of the public sector have got really good individual projects. So I think a league table is not really worthwhile. In terms of the economic crisis, there's several things. One is, of course, another quote is the William Gibson one about the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. You know, there were people saying there's going to be an economic crisis before it happened. Predicting exactly when or how or what shape is another matter. The interesting question is who is listening and what they might have done differently if they were. I would say that, partly following the Queen's question, there's some really interesting work going on amongst academic economists about narrative and about what stories about what was going to happen economically were circulating in the kind of 10, 20 years before the crisis, and why those weren't paid more attention to. So at least they're trying to learn.
Thank you. There was a really interesting blog that I read about the Civil Service Code, which was the civil service, values are integrity, impartiality and neutrality. But what if they were innovation, involvement and integration? What sort of civil service might you then have? And so maybe it's time to change the civil service values. Who knows? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions too. We're going to move into a coffee break and then into workshops, which you should have already registered for. The Go Science workshop is in Syndicate Room 1. Bill Sharp on the Three Horizons is in the Wallace Room. Gwent Futures team and Ash Futures are going to be in here, and then the Welsh Government workshop in Syndicate Room 2. If you could, we're running slightly behind schedule, about 5 minutes, so if you could aim to get to your workshop just after 10:45, that would be brilliant. Thank you.